After Star Trek, TNG Season 1, Captain Picard's starship lacked one thing every other Enterprise had. When Star Trek, The Next Generation launched in 1987, it carried the enormous responsibility of updating Gene Roddenberry's optimistic vision of the future for a new generation. The Enterprise D was bigger, sleeker, and packed with holodecks, saucer separation, and a far more diplomatic captain in Jean-Luc Picard. But after Season 1, a subtle absence began to define the ship and set it apart from every other Enterprise that had come before or after: the lack of a chief engineer as a central, consistent character. This might seem like a small detail, but in the grand history of the Star Trek franchise, it was practically a betrayal of tradition. Every previous Enterprise had relied on its miracle working engineer, Scotty in the original series, Charles Tucker III in Enterprise, and even engineers in the films who became fan favorites. Engineering was as central to Starfleet storytelling as the bridge itself. But in TNG, that role disappeared into the background, leaving the heart of the ship without a single face to define it. The great engineering shuffle of Season 1. In The Next Generation's first season, the Enterprise D technically had a chief engineer, but you'd be forgiven for forgetting them. In fact, the position rotated through multiple actors and characters, including Lieutenant Argyle, Logan, and McDougal. None lasted more than an episode or two. These engineers weren't written with depth. They didn't have memorable quirks, and they certainly didn't stand out as narrative anchors like Scotty had. It's telling that most fans couldn't even name them without looking up a reference guide. While the bridge crew of Picard, Riker, Data, and Troy grew stronger with each outing, engineering felt like a revolving door, manned by day players who never stayed long enough to matter. The writers quickly realized that the setup wasn't working. Instead of continuing to force an engineer character into the mix, they quietly abandoned the role altogether. By Season 2, the title of Chief Engineer had essentially vanished. Why Picard's Enterprise worked without one? The decision to scrap a central engineer might sound like a mistake, but in many ways, it helped TNG evolve into something uniquely its own. The absence of a Scotty-type character shifted the focus of problem-solving onto the main cast, particularly Geordi LaForge, who was promoted from helmsman to chief engineer by Season 2. But even then, LaForge's engineering duties didn't dominate storylines the way Scotty's had in TOS. Instead, TNG used its ensemble cast more democratically. When the warp core threatened to explode, it wasn't always an engineer sweating in the Jeffries tubes. Sometimes it was Data running calculations, Wesley Crusher patching things together, or even Picard himself working through a problem philosophically. This spread of responsibility reflected the series' broader emphasis on diplomacy, teamwork, and intellectual problem-solving rather than seat-of-your-pants technical fixes. The Enterprise D wasn't a scrappy starship where duct tape and miracle repairs kept things running. It was a state-of-the-art Galaxy-class vessel, designed to be self-sufficient and nearly invulnerable. The cultural loss of the miracle worker. Still, the lack of a consistent engineer left a noticeable cultural gap in the show. Star Trek had built part of its identity around the blue-collar hero of the future, the engineer who could keep a ship flying through sheer grit and genius. Scotty wasn't just a repairman, he was a symbol of ingenuity, the idea that even in the most high-tech society, human cleverness mattered. By contrast, the Enterprise D sometimes felt too smooth, too polished. With replicators, holodecks, and flawless warp drives, the ship rarely seemed in danger of falling apart. The crew never needed a miracle worker because the technology was presented as unbreakable. As a result, the drama often shifted away from mechanical breakdowns and toward moral or political dilemmas. That worked beautifully for TNG's tone, but it also meant the series lacked the kind of underdog grit that had defined earlier Star Trek adventures. Without a chief engineer sweating in the engine room, the Enterprise D sometimes felt less like a ship and more like a pristine space hotel. Geordi LaForge's halfway step. Of course, the writers eventually realized that fans miss having a familiar face in engineering. By Season 2, Geordi LaForge took over as chief engineer, and LeVar Burton's warmth and intellect helped fill the void. But Geordi was never written as a pure Scotty replacement. His blindness and visor gave him a unique perspective, and many of his best stories revolved around empathy, exploration, or scientific